Hi, I wanted to introduce a couple of ideas about human evolution, and this is a really interesting topic to understand a little bit more about the processes that shaped us and our adaptations and who we are as humans. So let's take a look here. The first thing is that there's a term we use to refer to our species, which is Homo sapiens, and all of the species that came before us that are our potential ancestors, and that term is hominids. So you'll see information about hominid evolution. This is talking about the evolution of modern humans and their ancestors. And the other thing is we're looking at human evolution here as a result of biological processes. So this is scientists looking at evidence and trying to piece together the story of where we came from. And what we know is that our own species is shaped by the same processes that affect all other species and populations. So, we looked at examples like the rock pocket mice and the Darwin's finches. We could think about how those same changes in the environment, those same kinds of changes, would have shaped our ancestors and resulted in the evolution of the adaptations that we have today. One common misconception is that people say, well, humans evolved, evolution says that humans evolved from monkeys, and that's not really true. That's not really what we would say in evolution. The theory of evolution says that species change over time and that they're related to what we call common ancestors. So this is a species that lived in the past, and as populations of that species spread out and encountered different environments, they changed and eventually became multiple new species. And so this is the same natural processes that would have affected our own evolution. In the case of humans, what we know from the evidence is that our ancestors would have been more and more ape-like. So this would be something more like a chimpanzee or a gorilla. These are what we call the great apes. Monkeys are, we would be more distantly related to monkeys. So apes and humans are maybe most closely related, and then monkeys would be a little more distant, and if we kept going back, we'd eventually get to other mammals, and then reptiles, and then fish, and so forth, all the way back to the origins of life on Earth. So the modern humans are a species that lives today. All of the species of monkeys that we have, as well as great apes, are species that live today. And so we wouldn't be descended from any of them, but rather we would share a common ancestor with them. And in the case of humans, we do know that that common ancestor probably was more ape-like, something that maybe looked more like a chimpanzee, but wouldn't have been a chimpanzee because chimpanzees, again, are a modern species that lives today. We know that humans are related most closely to the great apes for a variety of reasons, but lots of evidence that shows a very close kind of relationship. If we look at even anatomical things, like you see the diagram there of the hand structures, you can see these great apes have hands that are very, very similar to modern humans. We also have a lot of information from genetic studies, looking at the similarity between genes and chromosomes and proteins and so forth. And the diagram there on the right shows a set of chromosomes for humans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans. And so, there's 4 for each one. And you can see the remarkable similarities in them, particularly between humans and chimpanzees. Our DNA is something like 97% the same, 98% the same as a chimpanzee. So very, very similar genetically, although, those differences are significant in that, we have a very different set of adaptations. We're an entirely different species. We are in no way chimpanzees, but, genetically, we're very, very alike. The other thing we know from the evidence is that if we look at modern humans and we look at all of our ancestors, they all trace their roots back to one place. And that's basically Eastern Africa, some different areas of Africa where we find different fossils of human ancestors, but really all tracing back to Africa. And that's interesting because, of course, then we could look at how did humans spread from Africa, this environment in which they evolved, to all of these other places, and how did they change as they moved to other places around the world. We know that if we look at the world today, we have traits that are characteristic of different populations. If we think about people that live in Europe or Asia or Australia or North or South America, and all of those people, anywhere they are in the world, would be related to this group of this original group of modern humans that lived in Africa, going back hundreds of thousands and even millions of years. The other thing we might think about then, if we know what the environment was in which our ancestors evolved, we might think about, well, what are the adaptations? And, humans have lots and lots of different adaptations, as do all species. But there are three that really stand out. And one is that we are what's called bipedal. And this means that we walk on 2 feet. We're, a species of primate that walks on 2 feet, and that's unique. There really aren't any other primates that walk on 2 feet. In general, there are very few animals that walk on 2 feet, and certainly not in the way that we do, especially over long distances and being able to run and so forth. So, bipedalism is one. Secondly is that we have really, really large brains compared to our body size. So this is the result of some sort of, evolutionary process as well, where apparently our brains became bigger over time, and we might think about why that would happen and what the advantage would be to having a large brain. And then also, thirdly would be our hands, and we have really flexible hands compared to the other primates. We're really good at picking things up and manipulating and shaping things. And again, we might think about what would it be about in our evolution that would result in an advantage for individuals that had more flexible types of hands, larger brains, and the ability to walk and run long distances on 2 feet. We also know some information about that environment in Africa where our ancestors evolved. We know that in the eastern part of Africa, in what's called the Great Rift Valley, over the last few million years, the climate has changed dramatically, and it's gone from an area that was largely a dense tropical sort of jungle, where the primates would have lived most of the time in the trees, to a drier sort of grassland that we call a savanna. So on the right there, we see the picture of the savanna, and there's still some trees, but also spaced out with large open areas of grasslands. And this would be the environmental change that's happening as our ancestors are evolving. They're going from populations that live in areas that are densely forested, to being in an environment where there might be, a small bit of space in between clusters of trees, and eventually larger and larger spaces, again, over the course of tens of thousands of years, even hundreds of thousands of years, that these changes in climate are happening. But that's affecting the evolution of our own species. And lastly, again, we can come back to this idea of the human family tree. When we look at the evidence, we know that there are lots of species that came before us that have human-like traits, although as we go further back in time, they become less and less similar to modern humans. And we also know that out of all of these different species that lived in the past, we're the only ones that survive. So, it's a question for the relatively recent species like Neanderthals and Denisovans, what happened to them? Why did they die out? And what was it about our species that allowed us to thrive and eventually populate the world? As we go back in time, another interesting thing we can think about is that, today we just have one species of human, but we know, again, from the fossil record that these other species, there were times where multiple species lived at the same time and place. So, we think about what happened when they encountered each other, and what happened when the first modern humans got to Europe and encountered the first Neanderthal populations, and so forth. So it's kind of an interesting, set of questions there, but, just wanted to introduce some of those ideas, and then you'll get into the research and learn more, and then, post some of your thoughts on the discussion.